So, what is suicide? Here's a definition. Death given an underlying cause of intentional self-harm or injury, poisoning of undetermined intent. Okay? Most deaths and injuries and poisonings of undetermined intent where the harm has been self-inflicted have been determined as accidental deaths as opposed to suicides. So that leads us to the assumption that essentially the judgment about whether something's a suicide is a social process. So therefore it's not 100% factual. In that sense, it might be socially constructed. And there are a range of factors that might influence a coroner whose job it is to decide how someone dies, how they get to the assumption of suicide. Here's a map of suicide rates as available as March 2002, with the red being the highest and the blue being the lowest. So on the global picture, about 1 million people a year die by suicide. It's about 16 per 100,000 of the population. On average, every one person dies by suicide every 40 seconds somewhere in the world. 1.8% of the worldwide deaths are suicides, and global suicide rates have increased by 60% in the past 45 years. Okay, you might want to consider, why do you think it has considered in the past 45 years? Okay, what things have changed in society that might have led to an increase in suicide? Postmodernists might be interested in that. But then also, you've got to consider that record keeping's improved in that period of time, which may make it seem that the suicide rate is increasing, when actually we're just better at detecting suicides and recording them accurately. So have a quick look at some of the statistics here. And what do they show us? Interestingly, when you look at ethnicity in suicide, the rate amongst young Asian women is twice the national average. And arguably this is because many wives who cannot have children or produce only daughters are seen at a much higher risk of committing suicide because they're not fulfilling their gender role within the family. Vienna Soni is an expert on Asian studies, and she said that the suicide rate of Asian women is nearly double their proportion of the population. Okay, it could also be linked possibly to an element of frustration, maybe with their role within the family. Okay, and we look at Durkheim's 4 categories of suicide. What type of suicide do you think it might be for an Asian woman who feels like she's really controlled by her family and her friends? Young Asian men seem to be less risk than young white men of British origin, however. There are a range of factors that might increase the risk of suicide, and rather than me read through all these, perhaps you could annotate this onto your PowerPoint. Apologies for the bottom, which has gone a little bit funny. It's talking about alcohol and drug misuse can influence the level of suicide. The higher drug and alcohol consumption, the more likely suicide is, and it's particularly high amongst young people, at the very bottom there. What groups do you think are much more vulnerable to some of these problems than others? And if we could assume that, for example, young people are more susceptible to alcohol and drug misuse, and therefore more likely to commit suicide, then Durkheim would argue that that is a social fact, a social pattern in suicide. So, Durkheim's study, Le Suicide, 1897. So, you might want to consider the date as point of evaluation. So, why did he choose to study suicide? Mainly to establish sociology as an academic discipline. Okay, he was studying at the period of the Enlightenment, when science was coming to the forefront of society, and he wanted to prove that studying society was just like the established sciences of physics and biology and chemistry, for example. And he wanted to establish patterns of social behaviour, and he called these patterns social facts, like undeniable facts, like facts of nature. He was a positivist through and through. He wanted to be as scientific as possible, didn't want to be subjective, didn't want his own biases to influence his research, so he just relied on official statistics from several European countries, which has led to the criticism that he was Eurocentric. And he regarded statistics as social facts. He took them at face value and believed that the statistics on suicide rates were true and accurate. okay? And he would establish correlations and reveal the causal relationships which led to suicide, so the cause and effect relationship that led to suicide. So, for example, one of the theories he tested was whether the weather led to increases or decreases in suicide. And it didn't. He managed to disprove that theory that the hotter climate, the lower the suicide level. He proved that wrong. So there's two key concepts in Durkheim's theory of suicide. The first one is the degree to which people are integrated into their society, so part of a family, at work, religious practices, for example. So the more integrated a group is, in theory, the less likely they're the less likely they are to commit suicide. And also social regulation, the degree to which society regulates or controls the individual's behaviour. So in societies that have certain laws and certain regulations passed on through religion, partly through socialisation, and also enforced through agents of social control, to some extent we kind of need those laws and elements of social control in place to feel safe. However, Durkheim argued egotistic is when social integration is weak, results from the individual not being sufficiently integrated into society. So, for example, homeless people, much more common in industrial societies. Okay, a word associated with this might be maybe have a lack of social collective consciousness. He argued that by comparing the suicide rates amongst Catholics and Protestants, it showed that the Catholics are less likely to commit suicide because they have to worship more frequently, they have more contact with their religious community, and therefore are more socially integrated than Protestants who do not have to worship so frequently or have as much contact with their religious community. Anomic suicide is also common in industrial societies. This is when social regulation is too weak. So when people are no longer regulated by society and traditional norms and values are disrupted in a series of rapid social change, which produces a lot of uncertainty. And a good example of that might be the Wall Street crash back in 1929. People lost lots of money, they lost their businesses, people lost faith in the government, so people did feel a sense of, I suppose, enemy, I suppose. You know, they didn't feel controlled by society. And Durkheim did point out that suicide rates increase in times of economic booms and busts. Okay, so not just the bad times, also the good times. Because, again, that's time of rapid social change when things start to get better. Financially for some people, but maybe not everyone. Altruistic suicide is much more common in pre-industrial societies where social integration is far too strong. And the best example of this that I can think of is the Japanese kamikaze pilots in Pearl Harbor. But there's also the Hindu wives who used to traditionally throw themselves on the funeral fires, or pyres as they're called, where their dead husbands would be being burnt to send them to the afterlife. The wives felt that it was part of their duty to burn and go to the afterlife with them. Okay, and you know, you got the example of maybe in the Plains Indians, some of you might know from history, where the elderly would walk out into the desert and die of exposure rather than be a burden to the rest of their family because the tribe was so important. Fatalistic suicides are also more common in pre-industrial societies. So this is when the social regulation is too strong, where people are controlled far too much more common amongst slaves, and as a result is very rare in industrial society because we do not use slaves. But any country where there's a high level of state control or employer control of the individual, when someone feels like they have no control over their fate, okay, so hence fatalistic suicide. And Durkheim said, the suicide of persons with futures pitiless, blocked, and passions violently choked by oppressive discipline. So you might want to consider more recent examples in communist China, Russia when it was communist as well, possibly. So, can you please tell me which of these examples is which type of suicide? So, altruistic, anomic, fatalistic, and egotistic. Which of these examples fits with which type of suicide? When considering Durkheim, it's quite easy to, as they say in sociology, diss Durkheim for many of the problems of his methodology, like relying entirely on official statistics, for being too Eurocentric. In a sense, he only looked at European factors. However, it is a sociological classic, and it has been used for over 70 years and has formed some of the basis of many of the intervention strategies into vulnerable groups who might be at high risk of suicide. It's also very useful to use as evidence in any questions about whether sociology can be a science. However, some of the weaknesses, it did rely too much on official statistics. Medical knowledge was actually limited at the time when he did his study, so many people might have been classed wrongly as not being a suicide when actually it was a suicide. Also, autopsies were very rare, so something might have appeared as a suicide but actually could have been a poisoning. Cannot verify the responses because we don't know how the data was collected, who collected it, and it wasn't very standardized across Europe. So some countries collected it in a certain way, and other countries collected the data to different definitions of key concepts, for example. Interpretivists would argue that the statistics are socially constructed. They're the outcome of a social process. Coroners are people. They might expect certain types of people to commit suicide more often, so therefore when they see something that looks like an accidental death, or they're not sure, if it's a young person who's been known to use drugs, for example, they might say, oh, this is clearly a suicide, because young people are more likely to commit suicide, rather than maybe a well-off middle-class man. They might judge that as an accidental death. Arguably, he overestimated the role of religion. Okay, there could have been many other factors that might have explained why, for example, people are less likely to commit suicide in Southern Ireland and more likely to commit suicide in Britain. The big difference, Durkheim said, was that Southern Ireland was Catholic and Britain was Protestant. But there could have been a range of other factors as well going on that might explain why the suicide rate was higher in Britain. For example, Britain was much more successful economically, so that could have factored in terms of rapid social change during the industrial period as well. It's worth remembering that interpretivists are very interested in the meaning and therefore the real cause of suicide. Okay, so they like to know, what did suicide mean to the people that tried to take their own lives, or the people that did successfully take their own lives. So as a result, they are not interested in official statistics because they cannot explain why people commit suicide. They are much more interested in qualitative data on suicide, such as suicide notes would be a very good example.